Today I wanted to talk about some pixel art tips and tricks. So how many people have worked with pixel art in here before, or tried to work with it? I mean, it's difficult. Okay, a couple people. Great, a lot of new faces. So first things first is a program. You got to use something to actually make pixel art. The number one thing I've seen recommended is what's called AESprite, or AESprite, or I don't know how you pronounce it, but it's $15 one-time pay, and I've heard really good things about it. I haven't bought it myself because I use Photoshop, because I know somebody who's a graphic designer who shared the key with me. So if you don't want to buy Photoshop, don't, please. It's expensive. AESprite's a good option, but then there's also free options, like one of them's Paint.net. It's pretty easy to work with that to do pixel art. Today we're going to use a free web-based program. It's called Piskel. You can go ahead and open this now. It's piskelapp.com. Pretty easy to use tool online. You can save stuff offline to your computer and open it. You can save it to your browser, stored in like a temp, whatever. You can save it to your account. They let you make an account. You can export it as a sprite sheet when you're making an animation. It's pretty useful. So we're going to use that today to do some stuff. So does everybody have that open? Can I move on? Okay. So first I want to go through the workflow of how to make pixel art. So the first step is always to decide the resolution of your game. For instance, right here, maybe I will use the laser pointer. Right here, this is Game Boy graphics. This is Game Boy resolution. I used Metroid for all three of these to show the differences in some of the detail that you can do. So the Game Boy Metroid, you can see there are textures. There are pretty decent textures on some of these tiles. Stuff looks alright, but you can't necessarily tell what everything is. Like whatever, I almost said whatever Metroid is standing on. Somebody shoot me. Whatever Samus is standing on right here, I'm not exactly sure what that's supposed to be. Probably just some rock. But you know, it's not super obvious because they're working with limited resolution, and not only limited resolution, but you know, obviously color. There's no color there. But you can see here, Game Boy Advance has much better resolution that they can put. If you just look at the ratio of Samus to the size of the screen, you can see that here Samus is crouched and probably the same size on the screen as Samus standing up here. So there's a lot more detail on the armor. You can actually distinguish parts of the armor much easier than her crouching over here. And you can see a lot more detail. It's very clear. It's much clearer what certain things are. And then here is the Super Nintendo and NES resolution, where they can put in much higher detail just in terms of resolution, not necessarily in terms of quality. I would argue that Zero Mission, the Game Boy Advance one, actually has better graphics. In some ways, it's got better details, just because they were better at making pixel art. But resolution determines a lot. So the reason I'm specifically going over resolution so much is because adding more resolution makes it more detailed, but increases your work exponentially. Because, like, if you multiply these out for how many pixels you actually need to make for the most common sizes, the second option is a lot higher than the first. So if you want to make something look more detailed, understand that you're going to have to put in a lot more work for every asset to make it fit. So not necessarily a bad thing. You got to know that. Got to know that going in. So those two sizes are the most common sizes for pixel art. You do not have to pick one. You don't necessarily have to do that, but those are the most common sizes and they work pretty well. And that's for a whole screen. So step 2 is decide on the proportions you want to work with. Basically how big is your character going to be on the screen? So you've decided the resolution of your game, of how much detail you want to put into your game. Now you need to decide, okay, how big do I want my characters to be? So for instance, the examples I had here, I really wish that didn't pop up on the bottom. That's really in the way. The example I had here on the left, you can see Mario. So Mario, the proportion, the size of him on the screen is pretty small. Mario's a pretty simple sprite, and he doesn't take up much space. Whereas something like Street Fighter, a fighting game, the characters take up, when they're standing upright, almost if not over half the height of the screen. They're really tall because the focus is on the characters. And you can see that there's a lot more, spoiler, there's a lot more detail on the Street Fighter characters than on Mario. And this is also where you can decide, how big you want your tile maps to be if you're using tiling for stuff. Something like Street Fighter, you can see they don't really use tiles for backgrounds and whatnot. It's all custom done because it's just on simple battlefields. But something like Mario, they have to tile stuff, so you have to decide what size you want to do for repeating stuff, because that should usually be consistent if you're using a game with a lot of tiles, because if it's not consistent, you can get with some weird size things that look strange to the player. So I just use the custom sizes from before, the 480 and 640, that these are the typical tile sizes and sometimes typical character sizes for that style. Of course, this is just recommended. You can use whatever you want. Step 3. So step 3 is the part where you can actually start designing things, and this is the part that a lot of people forget. For the people that have done pixel art, who is that again? A few people up here. How many of you guys have started drawing a character just from scratch in pixel art and then realized that the head was way too big or too small for the body and then had to resize everything because I've done that so many times. Please, please, please roughly sketch out not only your character, but the character fitting in the world around them and some of the backgrounds. Yes, you can do an up close of your character, but don't forget to also do it with the proper proportion and perspective. So rough sketch and then work off of that. Make your pixel art based on your rough sketch. Just so you can get the proportions right, so you can get the character looking the way you want, all of that. Step 4. So this is the part where I'm supposed to tell you exactly how to go about this step by step, but I can't, because this is kind of like every art style, every form of art, where it's kind of an iterative process. You start with something, you work with it. It's probably going to be terrible at the start. I don't think anybody who does pixel art, their first attempt looks good, but you change it, you adjust it, you change the shading, you restart sometimes. You just modify it and see if it looks better, and then you keep trying until you get something that you think looks good and that fits your game. This is important. Do not just make all of your characters, because you will probably waste a lot of time and work. Reason being, when you create a character and then you create the background and some of the things that they're going to be standing in, you might realize that your character doesn't look right, that the proportion of it doesn't fit, that the art style isn't the same. So rather than making a bunch of background pieces and then putting in the characters and realizing I need to change every background, or doing it vice versa with characters, try creating one scene with all of these things together. Put in the character, put in the background, put in a couple of assets, and then make sure that the art style works. Make sure that they fit before you get into too much work and waste too much time.
Another thing, I know the game Spyro had this problem, that
Spyro the Dragon?
Yes.
Okay.
They tried to make a green dragon with a lot of green backgrounds and whatnot. So they ended up changing out their entire character asset to make it purple so that it would stand out. So seeing colors side by side is also useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, taking a character in isolation might look great, but you need to make sure that they look good in the game. Absolutely. And they would have saved time for them if they had at first seen how the colors would look before doing the high-res model and looking at that. So, finally, step 5, adjust your assets. Regardless of how many things you do at once, regardless of how nice you make it look, you'll probably still need to tweak some stuff. You'll probably still need to redo some stuff to make it fit. And this is the step where you should be trying to make sure that everything really links together and really clicks. where you can put in similar levels of detail, make sure that the color schemes work, that you don't have either too much contrast or too much blending in the background, like green on green, and make sure that your art style looks consistent so your character doesn't look completely out of place. Unless your game's about your character looking completely out of place, in which case that's fine. So that's kind of the workflow. Does anybody have any questions before I move on how that works? Does everybody have paper with them, by the way? We have some extra blank pieces of paper that Jamil's got. If you need sketch paper and you don't have any paper. Does anybody not have any paper? Raise hands. One back there, or a couple back there, however many. Okay. That'll be useful in a bit. I'm not gonna. I still want to go over some more stuff. I'm just making sure people have paper before I forget. So that's kind of just the workflow. Now I want to move into some of the tips and tricks because I did call this pixel art tips and tricks. So tip number 1: pick the right colors. Like I mentioned to some of the early people, I'm not really the person to be talking about this. I'm colorblind. I can do my best, but it's not going to be great. But you should pick the right color scheme. So how many of you have heard of color theory? Heard the phrase color theory? I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not knowledgeable enough about that to talk about actual color theory. But basically what you want to do is looking at this nice little shape over here to the right that I found online. You want your colors, you want each pixel that's touching another pixel in the same image. So not necessarily character on background, but for colors in your character, you want them to follow this circle somewhat. And at the very least, follow the black lines. So if you have yellow right next to purple, it will look weird. And it will probably look bad. Because they just don't, they just clash too much and they don't really work. So if you need yellow and then you want purple, put some other colors in between. Have it go at least a little bit gradually from one to the other so that it looks at least a little bit better. For pixel art, so point number 2, using a color palette. Have any of you ever played a game where they use a really big color palette for pixel art and it kind of just looks blurry a little bit? Or seen images of that? Anybody? It's probably not often because good games don't do that. So you probably haven't played a bunch of those games or seen a bunch of that. A lot of games. This started back in a lot of older games where they actually had limited color palettes because of hardware. So does anybody know why Mega Man's blue, for instance?
Is the sky was blue?
No. Because the NES had more shades of blue to work with than any of the other colors. So they picked that to try and make the most detailed sprite. That's literally the only reason he's blue. And that's iconic now. Like, he's always blue. That's Mega Man's color. But they only picked that because it had the most shades in the NES.
And then why is Mario red?
Have you seen the level of detail on Mario? It's not much.
Oh.
It's really not much. The original Mario is very small and very meh looking. But a lot of people recreate that to try and go for a more like nostalgic feel, so that's why a lot of people use smaller color palettes. But limiting things can also just make things look more stylized, which we'll get into in a bit. When you're making highlights and shadows, so when you have lighting, this was just like a minor point that I found was pretty useful, you are allowed to change the hue as well. So let me show you what I mean by that. So this, right here, this was just something I was making beforehand. This right here is colors. All right, it's just basic color. Can anybody tell me what left to right means here?
Saturation?
Yes. That's saturation. It's basically how much color do I want to put into it. It's either very colored or absolutely no color whatsoever. It's basically gray and between gray and color. Up and down is the actual lighting. It's basically how like basically just between white and black, between light and dark. It's pretty simple. It's just how bright it is. This right here, going between the colors, that's called hue. So this is the hue. When you are making highlights or shadows, you are allowed to change the hue. A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people say, oh, this is my red. I'll use this for my shadows. I'll use darker red. For my light, I'll use lighter red. But that doesn't always look good. Sometimes you want to move it over here. Sometimes you can even make it look a little bit more orange. It looks good. I don't really have an example to show right now, but it does not look as wrong as it sounds like it would. And it can actually look pretty good. So, biggest tip I can give for colors, experiment. Play with it. So for instance in Piskel, I haven't really gone over what's in the tool necessarily yet, but there is this button that's called Paint All Pixels of the Same Color. If I want to change a color across the board, you can just change an entire color. So if you want to change the coloring on your highlights or your shadows, a lot of tools just have the option to quickly change all of them. So try different colors. Experiment. See what looks good. So,
one other thing that I've at least ran into when making art and shadows, if you have one main color for a thing and you want to add shadows and then highlights, usually that main surface, I'll have the highest saturation anything will. So for the highlights, I'll drop the saturation. For the shadows, I'll drop the saturation and then make one lighter, one darker.
Yeah, I mean
that way, when you go lighter, saturation really comes out. When you go darker, you want it more gray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. That for highlights and shadows, you should do that. But your base color shouldn't necessarily be super.
Yeah,
saturated.
It's just the most saturated of those two.
Yes. Okay. That I misinterpreted that. Yes. That is a good point. That is a good way of doing it for sure. So, tip number 2, lighting. This is where a lot of people start making pretty mediocre looking pixel art. This is a way to avoid that. It's always important to consider where you want your light to be coming from. A lot of people do what's on the skull on the bottom left, where they do what's called pillow shading. And that is where there is no clear, definable light source, and they kind of just make it, they just put the highlights and shadows sort of all over the place. And it doesn't really look realistic. It doesn't look like it doesn't look like it exists. It kind of just has lights all over the place. It looks like it's in a room with light coming from every direction. Whereas the one on the right, they had an idea of where the light source should be coming from, and put the highlights and shadows accordingly to fit that. And you can see it looks much better. It actually looks like a believable skull sitting somewhere with a light pointing at it. And then I also had this example over here of having a light and considering exactly the angle as well as possibly things blocking it. And that's important to when you're making a scene for a game, so when you're designing the character, but also like the buildings and whatnot, consider where the light is coming from. If you have sprites shaded to have two different light sources, it will look wrong if they're next to each other. It just won't look like they're actually existing in a world. It'll look like two sprites are on the screen at the same time. So
it will break immersion.
Yeah. Immersion.
Immersion.
So, tip number 3, when you are working in pixel art. So tip number 3 is work in the right conditions. What I mean by that is get a good background and use the preview. So when you're working with a background, do not use white. Do not use purple. Do not use colors. Do not use anything with high saturation. And do not use white, because they won't look the same when they are... They won't look the same when they're on a different background. Your objects will look different because of how colors work. That's why I have this example of classic optical illusion where this red in the middle here and this what looks like yellow-ish, orange-ish right there are actually the exact same color. But it's just because of how the shading, or because of how the shadow looks and how it changes our view of the color. So it's really important to use the right background color. So the typical rule of thumb is to use 50% gray for indoors scenes and 70% gray for outdoor scenes. That if you're working with that, it tends to look better and it's easier to get the colors right. I believe Piskel actually has that built in, or at least something similar. If you go to preferences, miscellaneous, I believe that there's 2 colors that you can choose. I don't have any background, do I? Okay, this should be what people's screen should probably look like coming into it. So if I'm making a black circle for whatever reason, Piskel has the options of having a medium contrast and a dark contrast. So this is what you should be using probably is this for indoors, this for outdoors.
That outdoors you will be on darker things?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
To get the colors right. I don't know how to explain it. It just makes it easier to get the colors right.
Okay, cool.
It makes it less likely that you'll misinterpret something. And then the second thing I have on here is use the preview when you're working up close. And that's what this image is. If you are zoomed in on an image trying to change some of the pixels, always have some preview panel up, because when you are making small, minute changes, you might make changes that look good on your screen, but might not look good for the character. They might look completely wrong. So just always keep something up so that you can always see the bigger picture. And I believe Piskel also has that with this. And you can choose like full size, so it shows you the full image. So if I'm zoomed in, you can see the full thing. I mean, this is a really small picture, so that's not a great example, but so that way you can, if you're working in a really small space, you can always see what it looks like with the full image. So those are my tips, but I did say tips and tricks. So before I move on to some of the tricks you can use for pixel art, does anybody have any questions or any points to make? Nope? Okay. So trick number 1. This is how to start making your pixel art look nice. This is a technique called dithering, where my way of explaining it is to basically just vomit between color changes. So if you have a dark gray and a light gray that you're using as shading, try to avoid just doing this. Try to avoid just the straight line. Your object will look plastic and jagged. It'll look strange. Dithering is basically where you just put pixels of either color on the opposite side and just sort of throw them in. You can do it in a specific pattern. A lot of people use checkerboard for some things. Or, I mean, you can play around with the patterns and do something stylistic of whatever you want. But the idea is you can basically create the illusion of a color in between without actually having a color in between. It's not that obvious that the background of this image is all black and white, because it looks like it's actually shaded kind of smoothly. I mean, clearly not smoothly, because you can see exactly where the pattern goes, but this is just an example of dithering. So it kind of gives the illusion of a little bit of gray and just going from one color to the other. And this, the knight, I like the cape. So you can see on the cape there's, I think, 5 shades of red. I think 5 total, but it looks very stylized because they took the different shades and they blended them together and threw bits of them into each other and tried to make it look like a texture, or, look better basically. So biggest thing I can say with this is definitely experiment. Try and see what you can come up with. Try and see what you can change. Try dithering some colors together, and then try changing the pattern. Try maybe picking different colors. Maybe some situations you don't want to use dithering. I mean, it's useful in a lot of different situations, but not in every situation, certainly. So trick number 2 is textures. So biggest problem a lot of new people do when they make pixel art is they create what's called the plastic look. So that's this image right here. So this is, I believe, a sprite from Terraria, I want to say, is where I found it. And this is what it looks like if you don't try to texture the surface. This left one looks plastic. It looks like it's not wooden. You would not guess it was wooden except for the color. The color's vaguely wooden. So the idea of texturing your pixel art is to try to understand how the highlights and shadows would work if a light were going across it. And that's not very easy to do. That's something that comes with a lot of experience. This is one of those harder things to help somebody with, because it's not something that comes easily, but it's something that you just got to try. You just got to experiment with. And it certainly depends on both the material that you're working with and the art style you're going for. And these are other examples of good texturing. I like this one a lot, that it shows what you can do if you take really plastic looking bricks, and I think that's water. That's supposed to be water. It's not very clear in this image. And then you can see that they're iterating with different textures and making it look as good as they can make it, until it looks very nice. Those textures do look like proper textures. So, moving on to trick number 3, banding. I think this is my last, this is the last part of this. So banding happens when you have basically noticeable bands of color and it looks really bad. So this is the classic case of what's called staircase banding, when you're trying to shade a bar, a line or something, and you just put the top pixels as one color going all the way down, and then the next color, and then the next color, and it looks terrible. It looks really bad. But a more noticeable, more practical example is this one, where this is supposed to be a boulder. And you can see that it's got this band of color going around it with all of these different colors, and it doesn't look like a boulder. It really doesn't. And there's a few ways of attacking it, a few ways of fixing it. So one of the ways is you can use dithering. You can see here that it's not really noticeable anymore that there's banding, because you've sort of blended the pixels together and mixed the different colors to try and make that less noticeable and make it more rough looking. The other option is to reduce some of the bandwidth. And that does sound kind of weird, because bandwidth is a very different thing. But reduce some of the band space width. So you can see that this sort of middle color is now much smaller, and so it's less noticeable that it's very clear banding. And then you can break up the monotony, so you can try and texture it. So here they try to properly texture it and then apply the shading based on how they would want the rock to look. And then I don't have an example on here, but you can also add even more bands. So if you wanted a bigger color palette, you could just put in more intermediate colors and mix them a little bit so that it's less noticeable when there's 2 or 3 really big bands of color. So, does anybody have any questions about any of this? Kind of a lot to take in, kind of just going all at once. Anybody? Comments? Was this informative to anybody? Did anybody get info out of this? Hopefully. Okay, then what I encourage you to do is to use the piece of paper you pulled out and try sketching something. Try sketching a character, a rock, a house, whatever you're looking to make, and then try running through the steps. Now, because we don't have too much time, I would not suggest trying to make a character and the world and everything and try and fit them in like I was talking about. Because we only have so much time, I would try to make something like a character, just like one single character or a background tile or something like that. This was something I made beforehand. where I was trying my hand at texturing to try and make these bricks look a little bit better, and I think it paid off because this has a built-in tile mode. And it's kind of hard to see in that corner. I don't know if you can make it any bigger that way.
You could probably scroll the FPS thing.
No, that's for animations.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. So I can explain a little bit of how this app works. I'm sure. How many of you have been experimenting it while I've been talking? You'll actually make me happy. You will not. I will not be offended. Anybody? Was anybody trying to mess with the pixel art? No. Okay. Well, anyways, it's a pretty easy to use program. A lot of it's fairly self-explanatory. It's got basic pen tool for drawing stuff. You can change the pixel size. They've got a really nice mirror pen where you can draw and get a mirrored image. So this is useful if you're making your character to yeah, there he is. To make it, symmetrical if you're trying to make it exactly the same on either side. And also got the options of doing vertical ones or even in every direction. Make some kaleidoscope looking stuff. Paint bucket, pretty self-explanatory. Paint all pixels of that color the same color is pretty useful. Like I showed before, it paints all of them there. A lot of this stuff is just kind of, you can get a handle for just by looking at it. I don't really need to go into all the details of this kind of stuff. They have a dithering tool, and I don't. Oh, that just does a checkerboard. It looks like. No, I think it just uses the two colors you picked, and then just creates a checkerboard between them. I wouldn't bother using that dithering tool too much because the checkerboard pattern, if you want to use the checkerboard pattern, sure, but there's other patterns that you can do. But more importantly, I'd say there's a few options here and over here that are really nice. So, namely layers and frames. So layers, if you've worked with something like Photoshop or I mean, a lot of things use layers. You can create layers, and these will have, you can put different images on these. So if you wanted a background and a foreground, you can keep those, and they will be together, and then you can merge them, for instance, and put them together, that kind of stuff. Kind of self-explanatory. You can order them, stuff in the back or front. But frames is where you can have a lot of fun. So frames is how you can create animations. So I can create this, for instance, add a new frame, and if you have this, the onion skin on, you can see the previous frame, and you can create an animation. So I'm just gonna make, whatever this would be, just to show it. What was the first one? The first one was coming out of the corner. I'll do that. And so you can see over here, it's really small. You can create an animation, modify, the FPS for the preview, and you can put things together to actually create animations in this. And it's really useful, especially because there's a save option. So save, you can save it locally on your computer as a .piskel file to use with this. You can save it in the browser, which I think saves it to like a temporary location or something. Or you can log in if you create an account and save it there. But there's also the option of exporting, where you can export it as an animated GIF. If you wanted to make your pixel art into just a GIF to show somebody or something, into a PNG. This is into a sprite sheet, so you can do it as a single frame here, or you can do a sprite sheet. Unity works great with sprite sheets. If you guys, if anybody saw the animations workshop, I'd check that out if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Unity works great with sprite sheets with creating its 2D animations. You can zip it, and this creates one picture for each frame and puts them all in a zip folder. So there's some pretty useful options for that. There's also a few things like this where you can rotate and flip stuff, yada yada. And also you can also do it to like all frames. So for instance, I can flip every frame so it now goes in a different direction. So there's a lot of different tools to use with this. So I'm gonna stop talking and distracting people if they want to work on their stuff. But I encourage you to first sketch out an idea and then try creating some version of it. And I'm sure the first version won't look great, but that's fine. That's good, because then I encourage you to either restart or try modifying it and make it look better, and to try iterating on it and try to make a character during this that you think looks good. Maybe even try animating it. And I encourage you to remember some of these tricks to try and make your character look as good as they can look, I guess.
Is there a way to change the opacity of the coloring real quick?
Yes, there is. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if you can do it by color, but I know that you can do layers. So each layer has a layer opacity that you can change. So if I make this layer, for instance, 0.5, that layer is now less noticeable, or it's just clear. So I think if you do it by layer, if you make a layer transparent and then layer it, then I think it'll work fine.
Yeah. Usually with opacity, you want to keep it to the layer being the one that's opaque, or else when you're drawing stuff with no opacity already existing, it doesn't turn out fast.
So there, see, like I've got that this top layer is black, but it's opaque. It's partially transparent, so it's kind of red because the red is going through the back.
Mm-hmm. If you can't like use, because when you click on the other one, it gets really like opaque.
When you click on the other one,
If you want to move here, the other one immediately gets really opaque.
Oh, because you probably have an onion skin thing on.
yeah. So looking at multiple layers tends to make other layers like that. If you go to preferences on the right, the little settings bit, and you go to miscellaneous, you can change layer opacity. So if you make it all the way up to 1, your layers will all be the same, will all be full opacity of what they should be.
I think what it's doing is it's having the top layer. If there's any layers on top of it, it would just make them a little bit less opaque. So
It does that to all layers except for
Oh,
Interesting. But you can change whatever you want it to appear as.
That's weird.
I mean, I guess it depends on what you're using the layers for. Like if you're using the layers for a background and then a character, it might be useful to have the background not be super noticeable. Or it might be useful to make it exactly how it should look. So it's up to you.
I just thought it'd be a nice feature to be able to look through.
I'm gonna try my hand at something. I just need to come up with an idea.